give. So this isn't a very long presentation. I just wanted to set the context for the discussions that we will have later on in the programming. So we're really just talking about climate impacts, their consequences for people and the ecology, and building climate resilience and sort of what that is and what we mean when we talk about climate resilience and climate adaptation. So ultimately, what we're talking about when we talk about climate change is that the planet is heating up. But that rise in temperature really has complex impacts for around the world. And in our region, what we see is the most intense impacts are really affecting the extremes. We're still going to have variable temperatures and seasons in New England, but we're already starting to experience some noticeable changes. So one is changing precipitation patterns. We're seeing more rain come down as heavy downpours and concentrated at certain times of the year rather than spread out throughout the year. We're seeing more frequent heat waves. And when we say heat waves, we mean days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We're also seeing more severe storms that bring with them a lot of wind, higher winds than we've seen before and more frequently. We're also experiencing sea level rise. And all of these things have significant consequences for everybody. So let's talk about some of those consequences. When we talk about heat, as the temperature rises, as I said, we'll experience more heat waves during the summer. And this really exacerbates heat island effects in urban and suburban areas, which in turn impacts air quality. And air quality, when air quality declines, this exacerbates respiratory illnesses. Those who work outdoors may be at higher risk of heat stroke and other heat-related illnesses. And we might see schools closed because they lack air conditioning. We might see a lot of people losing work days due to illness or because it's simply too hot to work outside. And those heat waves might be further exacerbated by, say, power outages. If there's a power outages because air conditioners are straining the grid, what do we do? What do we do when we don't have cooling centers or places to cool down? Not everybody has an air conditioner. Not everybody has a place to go. So these are some of the things that we want to think about when we think about the consequences of climate change. The changes in precipitation. One consequence of these changes is that we're going to see more flooding. Stormwater management systems, all those catch basins that you see in the street, and the pipes running underground to move the water away from people and buildings, those can become overwhelmed due to sudden downpours. They weren't sized, they weren't built for the types of rainstorms we're seeing today. So this could lead to flooding of roads, which interferes with travel. That interference could jeopardize people from accessing an evacuation route. It could burden public safety vehicles and disrupt them from getting to where they need to go. It can damage infrastructure, like dam failures, which you see at the top here. Or flooding of people's homes, which you see on the left. The flip side of this is drought. We'll be seeing more heavy downpours and they'll be concentrated. So we're going to see more severe and more frequent drought as well. And this drought is further exacerbated by the heat waves we just talked about. And this is going to interfere with the drinking water supplies. And the availability of water for public safety activities and recreation. And again, we've already started to see some of these occur. Wind. So we're going to see more damaging thunderstorms and nor'easters. We'll see damage to schools, to homes, downed trees, interfering with travel, power outages. So these are significant consequences that we, again, are experiencing and need to prepare for so that we can bounce back from it. And throughout this entire discussion, we have to keep in mind that not everyone is affected the same way when it comes to climate change. So if we take heat, for example, local temperatures are going to be higher in a very urban developed area with lots of paved surfaces, as you see on the right here, versus a very leafy green, treed development. And those impacts, affect those not only who live in those neighborhoods that have been more developed, but those who are less able to get out of the way. They're less able to bounce back after disruption or loss of resources, for example. So we really need to keep this in mind as we talk about planning and implementing climate resilience building projects. So throughout this project, you're going to hear us use the term priority populations to identify communities who might be disproportionately or inequitably vulnerable to harms from climate change. And it's through no fault of their own. So I just want to make clear that people are not inherently vulnerable, but structures that make it more difficult for some people in our community to adapt and cope with climate harms make them disproportionately vulnerable to those harms. And so we need to prioritize these communities, and we need to prioritize engagement with these neighborhoods. So this project is in part intended to facilitate community-driven planning and implementation of climate resilience projects. Those communities that have been made most vulnerable by virtue of their exposure to climate change impacts and their ability to cope with those impacts are on the front lines of climate harms, and they need to be able to define for themselves the challenges they face and the solutions most relevant and appealing to them. So through this lens, we want to think about not only who isn't here, who isn't at the table tonight, and who we need to invite, but also who we should engage with through our work. A lot of you are here representing civic organizations, community-based organizations. So how do we support your work, and how do you incorporate some of this resilience building in that work and with the people that you're working with? So this is just another diagram of what we mean when we talk about priority populations. You've really got to think about people's lived expertise and the underlying factors that increase their vulnerability, which again is not their fault and has been put in place by the structures within society. And so we really need to make sure that that is top of mind as we're planning these projects. Now, so far, we've talked a lot about the consequences of climate change for people, but it also has consequences for the environment itself. So some of the ecological effects are, heat exacerbates drought and wildfire conditions, and a change for conditions for disease-spreading insects, for example. We might see more West Nile, more Triple E, more Lyme in the future. We'll see more invasive species. Precipitation changes can cause sewer overflows, which is in the upper right here. And those sewer overflows can pollute streams. We'll see exacerbation of drought and reduced water availability for fish, wildlife, and plants. We may see more algae blooms, which can cause illness, but also are devastating for fish and wildlife. And with wind, we may see changes to habitats, right? We might see loss of tree cover and resulting destabilization of soils and increased erosion, more nutrient pollution in waterways. And again, we'll see, invasive species that could crowd out native plants and wildlife. So climate change has a lot of consequences for a lot of different aspects of our lives. So what are our communities doing about it? So as I said, this is part of a project that's focused on regional climate adaptation. And we're interested in facilitating more robust community involvement in the planning and implementation of climate resilience building projects throughout the watershed. So tonight is the first meeting of our community advisory group. We're also engaged in community education. Last year, during phase 1 of this project, Weston and Sampson developed a watershed-wide flood model. We're going to further enhance that over the next 2 years, come up with some concept designs for regional flood reduction measures in the Neponset. And we're facilitating communication among municipal officials to talk across municipal lines, because climate change is affecting the region as a whole, not individual towns. Another key thing I want to make sure that everybody understands is we're really focused on climate resilience. And so what is that? It's the ability to withstand and bounce back from climate impacts. And it requires acknowledging that there are existing changes and future inevitable changes, even if we stop greenhouse gases today, and we need to adapt to them. So you often hear about climate mitigation and the need to reduce emissions, and it is critical to do this immediately, but certain changes are already in motion or have already occurred, and communities need to adapt to them to be safer and healthier. So this is just an illustration of the difference between the mitigation and adaptation projects that you might hear about in your community. So I'll stop there just for a second to see if anybody has any clarifying questions about the information I just presented. And I can't see anybody, so let's see, you can just raise your hand or put it in the chat.